Okay, we're live. Hi, I'm Gauri, and John is at home right now. Hi,
Hi,
John.
everybody.
And today, John is going to help us set up a Gulp workflow. Um, so, how was your weekend, John? Everyone had a long weekend in the United States.
Yeah, no, I had a pretty good 4th of July. Me and my friends, we went out to Reno and we went to like a food truck festival, which was, I just ate way too much food. There was also like a wing festival, and we went to that too. And so I probably ate like enough food to survive for the next week. So I guess my diet this week is nothing but, water. But it was fun. I gambled a little, didn't win big or anything, but came back with more than I left with, so that's always good.
Yep.
But it was fun. How was your weekend?
It was pretty good. It was quiet. Spent some time with my niece and just sat at home, which was really good.
I know that was, I think, my favorite part was when we were like all done doing the stuff, and I got to go sit back at the hotel for a little bit and just
Yeah.
relax. It was nice to get away, and it's always fun to celebrate the 4th of July, shoving deep fried food in my face. So, but today, I guess the big thing we're talking about is Gulp. And so a couple weeks ago, we did a demo about Grunt, which is a task runner and sort of a build tool. And Gulp is in the same vein as that. It's here to run minification, concatenation, all those kinds of tasks for you. So you can focus on what's most important, and that's sort of the development of your site, as opposed to the building process of your site. So I guess I set up a little demonstration today. There's a repository as well, which you can find in the broadcasts section of the discussion boards. It's under the title Gulp and setting up a Gulp workflow or something similar to that. Or it's just github.com/johnudacity/gulp-start. And you can follow along with that repository if you want. Or, you can always just come back.
John, you also posted it in the broadcast category.
Yes. And yeah, I mean, you can follow along now, or you can download it and follow along later. I'll also be posting up sort of like a short guide of all the steps we go through on the forum. So if you just kind of want to watch now and then go through the guide later, I think that's maybe the best way to do it, because I might go a little fast at some parts, and I think it's easy. Like when I watch people do demos, it's easy for me to like miss something, and I'm like, wait a minute, I just got lost, and then I'm spending more time figuring out how to get back to where they were than actually listening to them. So it might be best to just like sit, listen. If you think of any questions, feel free to ask them. But let me start screen sharing here, and we can get started. Let me just make sure I'm sharing the right screen. All right, there we go. So this is my repository. I have it downloaded already, but just to kind of give you a little overview of what it looks like, there's an index.html file, which has some stuff going on. There's a CSS folder, which has some compiled CSS in there. There's a JS folder that has some JavaScript in here. And there's a style folder, which has a stylus file. So stylus, for those of you who aren't aware, is a little bit like less or Sass. It's a pre-compiled CSS language, which you can use Gulp to compile into CSS, which makes it usable by the browser. So we can take a quick peek at this and see that, right, it kind of looks like CSS, but the syntax is all a little weird. So what we're going to be using today is we're going to be using Gulp, which is known as the streaming build system, to basically automate our workflow, automate a bunch of these processes that we probably don't want to have to think about when we're working on our project. So I'm going to take you from installing Gulp to setting it up to running a few basic tasks to setting up maybe some more advanced tasks if we have time. So let's get started. So the first thing we actually need before we begin using Gulp is we need to make sure we have Node.js installed on our system. Installing Node is really easy. It works on Linux, Mac, Windows. All you have to do is you go to nodejs.org, and you click this big old install button right here. It'll download some stuff, and then you just run the executable, and it'll set up Node on your system. If you have any problems setting up Node, feel free to mention that in the forums, and I'd be happy to help debug them. But it usually works pretty well. An easy way to check, I think, is if you do node-v, it should spit out the version of Node in your terminal on Mac and Linux. On Windows, I believe it downloads the Node shell, which you just open up and you run all your Node commands from there, and hopefully that shouldn't be broken. I think it's easier to break Node on Mac and Linux than it is on Windows. Is my text big enough on my terminal, Gary?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, cool. So once you have Node, the next step is to navigate into your directory. So I'm in my project that I want to begin, gulping here, and I need to install Gulp, or I need to set up Gulp on this project. So when you install Node, you get what's called the Node Package Manager, or NPM, and you can use the command npm install to install just about any Node package available. And you can search for the Node packages on the Node Package Manager. But for our case, we're using Gulp, so we're going to use npm install save dev Gulp. So this is going to take just a second, and we can see that it's doing something. And my dog seems to be very interested in something. Come here, dog. There we go. So it's all installed. So now if we look at our project directory, we see we have these this one folder that was created, which is this Node modules folder. And if we take a look at what's inside there, we see we have Gulp. So basically what that npm command did was it looked at the Node servers, it got Gulp, it brought that back to my project, it created this Node modules folder, and then it set up Gulp. And it got all the necessary files and dependencies to run Gulp on my system in this particular project folder. So now that I have Gulp, just like with Grunt, we needed a Grunt file to basically put all our code in and run everything. Here we're going to do something similar. We're going to make what's called a Gulp file. And so we got our Gulp file. So let's actually open this up and open up our Gulp file. So we got a whole lot of nothing in our Gulp file. So let's get started actually setting up our Gulp file. So when we did the demo with Grunt we saw was very much like we set up a big JSON that sort of configured all of our operations. Well, Gulp kind of takes a different way of thinking, different philosophy. It's very much a convention over configuration. So we're actually going to be writing a lot of JavaScript. So we're actually going to start with var Gulp equals require Gulp. So what this is doing is this is using Node's require module, which you can kind of think of as like an import. It's basically importing this necessary file. It's looking at the Node modules folder, it's pulling in Gulp. And we're basically just storing it in this variable Gulp to use later. And throughout Gulp, all we're going to be doing is we're going to be defining tasks. And so just like Grunt, there's a default task we can define. And a Gulp task takes two parameters. It takes a name, and it also takes, and actually let me make this text a little bit bigger, and it also takes a function or some sort of callback. There's a few other attributes you can pass into here, but this is the pretty plain and simple sort of Gulp task. So let's make our function actually do something, and then we'll see how to run Gulp. Let's just do something simple for now. Let's just do a simple console log. I'm running Gulp. Okay, so we've set up our Gulp file. We've set up this really simple task. So just like with Grunt, the way we run Gulp is just with the command Gulp. and this will run our default task. So by putting this in, we're going to run this default task. And we can see that our console logged out, I'm running Gulp. Fantastic. So pretty simple setup. You can also, create another task and give it a specific name. We can just do another console.log from a robot, save it, and when we run Gulp, we see that it only runs our default task. If I do Gulp robot, that's going to run our robot task. So we can specify what tasks we want Gulp to run by just saying Gulp and then the task name. If we want to run multiple tasks, say I have another task, which is just hello, console log hello world. In my default task or in another named task, instead of using a function as my callback, I can actually specify an array of method names or task names. So this is going to run on when I just use Gulp, because this is my default task. It's going to look at this array of callback functions, and it's going to first run my robot task, and then it's going to run my hello task. So let me save this, and when I do Gulp, we see that it ran my robot task, finished my robot task, ran my hello task, and finished my hello task, and then it kind of ran these default tasks, which was running these essentially. So that's sort of the basic way of setting up, or just basic tasks in Gulp. Obviously, you're going to want to do a lot more, but this is sort of the basic structure of setting up a task that'll run in the terminal with Gulp. So let's actually figure out now how to do something a little bit more than just logging out to the console. Obviously, you can use Gulp to do that if you want, but nobody really wants to do that. You guys are here because you want to be able to minify files, make things look really nice, and make things performant. So let's get rid of everything in my Gulp file except for this var gulp equals require gulp. And let's install some plugins. So just like Grunt, Gulp has a whole directory full of plugins. There's 1,532 plugins total, and there's more getting added every day. Most of the big ones that you're probably using in Grunt are probably also have been made for Gulp. So for example, a popular one, right, is to concat your files. There's a Gulp concat. If you want to, uglify your files, which is basically minify file or JavaScript files, you can do that with Gulp as well. So you can search for plugins here, and if you click on plugin name, it'll tell you a little bit about that plugin at the Node Package Manager's website. It'll tell you how to install that plugin. So we would just run this command in our terminal to install the plugin. And it also gives you a little bit of a demo of the usage usually, and then depending on how well it's documented, some of the plugins are not documented very well. So sometimes you got to go bug the GitHub owner to explain some things, but for the most part, they're pretty well documented. Just some of them, especially when you start diving into the really new plugins, is when you'll start finding ones with kind of bad documentation. But the ones we're going to be using today are pretty well documented. We also see options and any sort of errors that could be outputted. So let's run this command, this npm install save dev, and we're going to do gulp uglify. And we're just going to give that a little bit of a second to run. All right, that runs. And I'm also going to install one more. I'm going to install gulp rename, just because that's going to come in handy. That's going to let us rename files pretty easily without having to dive into like string manipulation and stuff. So let's pop open our gulp file again, and let's include these as well. So we're going to include uglify. Ooh, I can spell. And we're going to include our rename plugins using the same code as we did to include our gulp file. Our gulp plugin, or module, I guess is the right word. Rename. Sweet. So now we have our uglify, which we'll use to minify our JavaScript, and we also have our rename, which we'll use to sort of rename files as we need to. So let's make a new task, and let's call this one scripts. And this will be our task which we use to basically run any sort of script methods. And let's give it a callback function. And in this function, we're going to specify a source file that we want to act on. And the way we do this is we use our gulp module, and we use its source method, so gulp.source, and then we specify what we want to look in. So specifically, we want to look in the JavaScript folder and any file that has JavaScript. So this star is what's known as like a catch-all. What we've created here is we've created here a glob, and this glob basically says look in the JS folder for any file, any name that also includes a .js. This is a little bit like regular expressions, but a little less robust than regular expressions. We can also look for like any subdirectories that may be in there by using like a double star and a slash. So this basically says look in the JS folder for any other folders, and then look for files that have the JS suffix. But since we don't have any folders in there, we're just going to do this. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use a pipe. So Gulp is all about using the input-output stream. And a pipe basically pipes either to or from this stream. You can kind of think of it like water pipes, I guess. The source is basically whatever gets outputted from this is going to get piped into this next method. So we can chain them together like this. We can have tons of pipes, chain them together like that. But sometimes you might have a lot of steps. So usually it's just easier to add a new line, tab it, and then just line it up like this. So we're going to pipe any of the contents that our gulp.source method finds into our uglify function. So basically anything that ends up getting picked out from this is going to get shoved into this method, and then we're going to get some results, and we're going to pipe that into our rename method, and we're going to rename it app.min.js. And then we're going to pipe the result of that into a gulp.destination, and we're just going to shove it into our JavaScript folder. So let's go ahead and run this scripts task now and see what happens. So let's do gulp scripts. All right, so it finished running. So let's take a look and see what happens. So we see here that we now have this app.min.js file, which has all the minified JavaScript in from our app.js file. Pretty neat. Pretty simple too. I think the nice thing about using this sort of streaming system as well is with Grunt, when you use the configuration file, what usually ends up happening is a lot of temporary folders get created, and that ends up taking a lot of time. Whereas with this input-output streaming, you're really not, there's no need to create these temporary folders, and everything just kind of runs a little bit faster. it may not be as noticeable on smaller projects, but as these Gulp files and Grunt files get a lot bigger, that's when you start noticing sort of the performance difference between the two. So that's great. Let's do the same thing. Let's minify our CSS now. So usually when I'm working on a project and I have decided like, okay, I need like a new step in my build. I need to minify my CSS, for example. So we have this, where is it? Our stylus, and we also have just our regular CSS that gets outputted from that. So we need to minify that as well. So let's figure out how to do that. So what I would do is I would start by going to the Gulp.js plugin directory, and I would look for maybe CSS, and let's see what that gives me. A bunch of linting things. Let's try minify in that search as well. I don't think I want that. Let's just try minify CSS, and here we go. We have Gulp Minify CSS. And so this is a Gulp plugin to minify CSS using clean CSS. So let's use this file to minify our CSS. So we're going to use the same sort of command, npm install, save dev, Gulp Minify CSS. And we're going to wait a second for it to install. And there we go. So it's installed, it's set up. If we look inside our node modules folder, we see that we have Gulp Minify CSS in there. So let's actually include that in our Gulp file as well. So we're going to have minify CSS equals require Gulp Minify CSS. And now let's set up a new task. We're going to call this our styles task. And now we're going to have to specify a source. In this case, we're going to specify our CSS folder. We're not going to do anything with the stylus file just yet. And we're going to look for anything that has a .css. We're going to pipe that into our minify CSS function or plugin. And we're going to spit that out to a destination. And in this case, we're going to spit it out to just a min CSS folder. All right, so let's run that, Gulp styles, let it do its thing. And we see we get a min CSS folder, and we get some minified CSS. Pretty straightforward, I think. And then let's say we want to run these both together. So one way we can do this is we can just say Gulp scripts styles, and that should run both of them. But you probably don't want to have to remember all the different names of all the tasks that you want to run. So usually it's a little easier to specify a default task, or maybe like a smaller subset of general tasks you want to be using that just take scripts.
John, there are a couple of questions once you're done running this one.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm down to take some questions right now. I think this is a good point to take some questions.
Okay.
So that's the basic function.
On your screen?
Sorry, what was that?
Do you want to see the questions on your screen and answer them, or do you want me to read them out?
No, yeah, feel free to read them out.
Okay. So Tom asks, what happens if there is more than one .js file in the folder?
That's a good question. So let's take a look. So let's actually add a new file here, and let's call this app2.js. And let's just put in some filler function here. A equals B. Being mad because I didn't. Okay, so let's take a look. So we have this app2 with some real basic JavaScript in it. Let's see what happens when we run gulp scripts in this case. All right, so it finished running, and in my app.min.js, we see that it actually only minified this new JavaScript file. The problem with this is it's because we're not concatenating these two first. So usually what you want to do in this process, and it was something I was going to get to later, was to concatenate your files and actually add an extra step here where you concatenate them using a concatenation plugin and then pipe them into the minification process and then set them as a destination. As you can see here, when we ran this, it just ran it on the single JS file instead of grabbing all of them inside this folder. See that again. Yeah, so in this case, there's an orchestrator error. Because it's mad because concat's not defined. Yeah, so usually it's best to concatenate your JavaScript files, or you need to output them all to a different name. So this is a case where using this rename function wouldn't be a good idea, because I'm basically renaming all of my files to this app.min.js and spitting them all out to here. And because it's doing one at a time, it does this one first, spits it out to here, does this one second, and then overwrites everything in here with that. So usually you should concatenate them, or specify, use some tricky stuff here to specify sort of like an iterative name. There's a few things you can do, and we can talk about those in a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks, John. So, Tim asks, how would you go about editing original documents if you've already ran them through a task, or does it keep the original copy in the same folder?
Yeah, good question. So typically, this actually might be a good chance. Let me show you guys a little bit better structure. So this is where structuring your project is really important. So here's just a little project that I've been working on. And so it's important to structure your project really cleanly. So here I actually have two folders. I have an app and a public. And inside my public folder, actually pretty much all my sort of minified code. Whereas in my app folder, I have basically anything that I'm working on. Another easy structure to set up is just to do, let me just make like a simple test folder here, is to actually separate a source and distribution folder. And in your distribution folder, that's where you're actually going to be sort of piping all of your outputted minified code to. And you're going to do all your development on the source code. So hopefully you won't have to go about editing the minified files because nobody wants to go through, right, and try and edit this. You're not going to be able to find anything. It's going to be much easier to just be able to go back and edit this and output the results of the minification process to either a new folder or file. And it's easiest to organize them as the source directory or the development directory, which is where you're doing all of your work, and then using Gulp or Grunt to build to a distribution directory where you'll have basically all your production-ready code.
All right. Thanks, John, and thanks, Tim, for the question. So Robert asks, what's the -- save dev for?
Yeah, so let me go back here. So typically in Node projects, I didn't do it this time, but you should always include a package.json file. You can set one up pretty quickly using the command npm init, and it'll take you through this sort of little step through guide, and you'll see that it makes this package.json file. So let me actually open that up and show you what's in there. This package.json file tracks all of our dependencies. There's developer dependencies and then regular dependencies. When you do save dev, it should throw them inside the developer dependencies. It didn't because I did this after the fact. But developer dependencies are modules and plugins that you as a developer are going to be using. That is, the public version of your site isn't going to rely on these modules or plugins or frameworks or whatever. Standard dependencies are going to be things like if you include Angular in your project and your site depends on Angular. Developer dependencies, like I said, are only going to be things that you use in the development process, or someone on a team or is forking your project should also be using in their development process because you've included, say, like a Gulp file or certain Bower components and things like that. That's what the save dev does. If you want to save just to your dependencies, you can do npm install --save, and that'll save them to your project's dependencies. So again, dependencies are basically things that are required for your app to run. Developer dependencies are things that are probably best to install if you plan on developing on that project as well.
All right. Thanks, John, and thanks, Robert. Great question. Stephen asks, where and how does Git fit with all of this?
Yeah, so Git and Gulp are two very, very different things. Git is strictly for version control. You're going to be using Git to basically track the progress of your project and, sort of track iterations throughout your project. You can kind of think of it, right, as like you're saving points in time at where your project's at. Whereas Gulp is largely going to be used for minifying and getting code ready for production. Oftentimes, these things kind of come hand in hand, and as you can see, there's a lot of sort of Git plugins. Let's see, Git. I think there should be some Git plugins. Let's see, Gulp, Git. No? I swear there were some Git plugins because I've used them before. Well, maybe it's just not filtering right now. Yeah, why didn't it find this? So there's a Gulp Git plugin which you can use to actually automate a lot of your sort of Git processes. So say you only ever minify your code when it's at a point that's ready to be committed, and you maybe just want to automate that commit process. Well, they have sort of some definitions here for how you can write tasks that do commits. They also have how you can sort of add files. So you can, I guess, use Gulp to automate your Git processes. But ultimately, the reason you're using Git and the reason you're using Gulp are different. Git is strictly for tracking the progress of your project, and GitHub is for hosting it online, whereas Gulp is for getting your code production ready and automating sort of all of these kinds of workflows that you'll be doing, from minifying, concatenating, to compiling things like stylus, Sass, CoffeeScript, to watching files for changes and things like that.
Okay, thank you. A couple of more questions, John. Michael asked if you concatenated the files, and I guess he's referring to the concat function. Wouldn't it try to also include app.min.js?
Yeah, you're actually right, and that's because I'm throwing it in the same folder, which is why it's a good idea to have separate folders. I did not structure this demo project very well, so it would try to include the app.min.js, but you can use globs to ignore files as well. I believe, let's see here. There's a way to exclude things using, I think it's like a double minus sign in the glob. It's been a while since I've had to try and do something like that, but yeah, you're right. It would totally try to include the app.min.js, which is why later we would be putting that file somewhere else inside our distribution directory, for example.
Right. And these questions keep coming, John.
Oh, that's fine. I'm totally fine with just answering them. Wow.
Sure. James asked, any chance there's an Unminify plugin for working on someone else's production code, say to repair a defect or something, where you don't necessarily have the source code?
So actually, you can do that right in Google Developer Tools. And actually, there are Unminify plugins as well. But if you look in the Developer Tools, if you go to, say, the sources, let me see if I can find some mess of stuff here. And you actually click on this little pair of brackets at the bottom here. It pretty prints it. The only thing it won't do that's still a problem is during the minification process, it replaces variable names with single letters to save bytes. So as you can see here, we have like A, and you can see it all over the place, A, or OA. There's no real way to sort of unminify these to their original variable names if you don't have the source maps they used. So you would either need to have a copy of their source maps, or just have to deal with all the kind of single letter variable names and kind of figure out what they're used for. There isn't a great way to unminify source code to the original work unless you have the source maps, like I said.
All right. Thanks, John. The next one is from Jeff. Will this be recorded and available for viewing later? If so, where can I find it? I missed the Grunt podcast. Jeff, yeah, if you go in your community and in the events, just type Grunt or Gulp. The recordings will show up. And as you can see on John's screen, he's going to the broadcast category where we also posted the transcript along with the video. So I think that should help you. Let us know if you have any troubles, and we'll make sure we link you to the video. Thank you.
Yeah.
More questions. Arvind asks, is there a way to run these in the background so you don't need to run the tasks manually, especially while using copy plugins and such?
Yeah, and actually that was one of the things I was going to hit on, which is watch tasks. So this is now, I guess, a good time to do this. So Gulp, just like Grunt, lets you watch files for changes. So suppose I want to work on my JavaScript and or my CSS or something, and not have to worry about, okay, I made a bunch of changes, let's compile my code. I just want it to compile every time I make a change. What I can do is I can create what are called watch tasks. And so the way we structure a watch task, so it used to be really kind of a pain in the butt until Gulp got updated, and then they've just sort of included their own watch functionality. So now you can just say gulp.watch. And again, you specify what directories you want to watch. and you specify a callback function. So it works very similar to a task. So there's just, the files you want to watch, and then what tasks or scripts you want to execute when that file gets or changes get detected in that file. So in this case, we would want to run scripts. For my CSS, if anything in my CSS changes, then I probably want to run my styles task. So let's see what this looks like. I'm going to just add this to my default. And so here we go. So we see that it runs my scripts, it runs my styles, and then it runs this watch task. And we can see that it's just waiting. Whereas before, when we ran our gulp task, it just finished and then it was done. Now it's actually sort of idling here, waiting for something to happen. So let's take a look and see what happens when we change something in our CSS. So let's make this red and save. We can see over here in my terminal that my styles task ran again. So in case you missed that, I'm going to make a change one more time. And watch here, and you'll see something change. So let's make our padding maybe 20 pixels. Save. And we can see that, again, our styles task ran. So that's basically how you sort of automate a lot of these processes, is by setting up a watch task. And this becomes extremely useful when you're developing. So you don't have to keep jumping over to your terminal and saying like gulp blah 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 blah. You can just go in, work on your CSS, know that the code is compiling. You're able to open up your project and examine it and watch for changes. It's really helpful being able to do that. And then usually, if like a lot of people usually have a question like, okay, how do I stop watching? In the terminal, if you use Control-C, that's just sort of like the kill task, and that'll take you back to just sort of the normal terminal. One thing that may happen, and I don't know if they actually updated this since then, was sometimes if you include a syntax error, it'll stop watching. So there's a few different methods you can use to just throw the error, but not to stop watching. The one I suggest is you use Plumber, I believe is what it's called, Gulp Plumber. And this basically prevents the pipe from breaking when errors occur. This way, when, say, maybe you do type an error here, it'll spit the error out to you, but it won't kill the stream. So in this case, because I'm not using Plumber, when it threw this error, it just blasted out this glob of problems, and then it stopped the watch task. And now I'd have to go in here, fix this, and then run gulp again. Using Plumber is definitely the right thing to be doing to make sure that you're still receiving the errors, but it's not wrecking your build process.
All right. Last two questions, John. So James asked, you mentioned earlier that Gulp works best on Macs and Linuxes. Is there a particular version of Linux which you would say it best works with? I
don't think I maybe accidentally said that, but it also works good on Windows. Just with Windows, you have to use the Node shell as opposed to just being able to use like the command prompt without. I mean, you can use the command prompt or PowerShell, but you're going to have to do some minor modifications and tweaking and stuff like that. Essentially, setting up Node in your path environment variable. As far as versions of Linux, which it works best with, I don't think there's a version of Linux that it necessarily works best in. I think Node, so Gulp, right, is just a module for Node. So any Linux platform that Node works fine in, Gulp is going to work fine in. And I think Node works in just about any Linux environment I've ever encountered. So you shouldn't have any problem there. If you do, though, let me know. I'd love to hear if there's a Linux platform you're using where Node or Gulp isn't working properly.
Mm-hmm. John, I'm not sure I'm saying your name right, but she asks, how do you handle Git for your source code, build code, or even GH pages for one project? Do you put them in a single repo or in different repos?
So yeah, I keep them all in the same repo. There's a few common patterns out there, and this is actually something I know a lot of students have been interested in, and I kind of want to do a write-up about. But usually what I have is I have my master branch, and then I usually set up 2 more branches, a development branch. Oh, what? Not a valid object name, master. Oh, I don't think it'll let me do that until I add this stuff. And then I also make, my GH pages branch. As far as like my source and distribution code, it all lives on the master branch. For my GH pages, I usually only keep my build code on there on my GH pages one, because that's the code that is going to be running on my GitHub Pages site. So usually you can specify, what files get merged into that branch, and you can take them out as well. And then for my development branch, that's pretty much a mirror of my master branch, and that's where I do all my development. And then when I'm ready to push changes, I'll push changes from my development branch to my master branch, and then from my master branch, I'll merge any changes into my GitHub Pages branch and specify that I only want to merge over my production-ready code. That's getting a little out of scope of Gulp, but that's sort of the process I would take. You can also, like I said, use Gulp Get to set up the process for doing that. So all you have to do, instead of having to do git add, you can just say Gulp build, and maybe that'll run through all these tasks and add the proper files and commit the changes and push them to the right repository and branch. But that's kind of how I set it up. So I do pretty much all my work on a development branch, push any changes from the development branch to the master, and then merge any needed changes from the master to the GitHub Pages branch.
All right. Questions? That's nice. So Alf, it's more common. In your transcript, could you please list all the helpful and most reliable Gulp plugins, especially for image optimization?
Yeah, I think I include quite a few of them. I also share like a Gulp file that I use. Yeah, I'll make sure to include those links as well. And so yeah, I'll make sure to include those.
All right. Thanks, John, and thanks, Alf. You're going to love answering this one, John. Would you consider Gulp better than Grunt, assuming they serve the same purpose?
So this is a very opinionated answer, but yes. I really like the speed of Gulp. I like the way it utilizes Node more than the way Grunt does. I like the fact that I feel like I'm writing in JavaScript as opposed to writing a big configuration file. However, I will say Grunt is very straightforward and very easy. It's easy to get someone started on Grunt, whereas with Gulp, usually to get it to be a little bit more masterful of it, you have to have a little bit of understanding of things like JavaScript promises, the input-output stream. And those are a little bit more difficult to learn than just, here's Grunt, here are the plugins for Grunt, here's the configuration file you write, go. To really like dive into Gulp and get the full power out of it, you do need to know some JavaScript.
All right.
But in terms of being better than Grunt, I think it is.
All right. Lila asks, when watching, is there a way to have the browser reload when a file is changed?
Yeah. And that's something that I'll include in my write-up as well, because I don't think we have enough time to dive into it today. But you can use, I believe it's called browser sync. Okay. Gulp browser sync. There's a great write-up on the Browser Sync's website on how to use Gulp.js with Browser Sync, and you can do that. There's also, I think, Gulp Live Reload. Yeah, Gulp plugin for live reload. So you can use it. There's a lot of different options. And then basically all you do is you set one of the tasks in your watch function. Say, for example, I set up, a browser sync task. Then here, when there's a change, it'll run my script code and compile, and then it'll also run, my live reload or something like that. So that's kind of what you would do there. And then that way you can just, have your index.html open. Obviously, this isn't going to work, but you'd be able to, watch for changes here instead of having to continually refresh.
All right. Thanks, John, and thanks, Lila, for the question. John Michael asks, how would you integrate testing with a framework like Jasmine? There you go. He's on it.
Yeah, so just like Grunt, Gulp, like if there's something you want to be able to do, say testing, Git, minification, just setting up production servers, anything, Gulp has plugins that do that more often than not. So in this case, with your specific question, you were interested in integrating tests with a framework like Jasmine. I simply just looked for Gulp Jasmine, and sure enough, there's a Gulp plugin that'll run Jasmine tests for you. You can, set up a task. You can specify, what tests you want to run, and you can pipe in the Jasmine method. This one's pretty well documented. It's created by Sundrasaurus, who's a pretty popular, famous JavaScript developer. You're not familiar with him. He's created quite a bit, as you can see here. But there's more often than not, there's going to be a plugin for the task at hand. So I would say just read into it a little bit. This one's very well documented, so it should be pretty easy to figure out. But almost anything that you normally have to manually do while developing code, a tool like Grunt or Gulp is going to allow you to automate that. And it's really, really great to sort of have these tools, just because it sucks having to do this stuff manually all the time. It takes you out of the build process to have to, stop, open up your terminal, run your tests, or stop, open up your terminal, run some minification program, or open up your index.html and have to refresh, or open up your app and have to hit refresh. Just having Gulp handle all that stuff for you is just going to make your life as a developer so much better. There's also a lot of sort of pre-written Gulp files out there. If you check out a scaffolding tool such as like Yeoman, or if you clone someone else's repository for a project, typically they already have sort of a build process set up. and you can just go about using their build process to work on their project. Or you, like I said, you can use Yeoman to use a generator that sort of sets all this up for you. But I'd say for the first couple times you're using this tool and kind of understanding how it works and understanding what some of these processes and workflows are, it's best to just kind of start doing it yourself, writing your build tool by hand a couple times, like in 2 or 3 projects, because you'll learn so much and it'll be that much easier to dive into somebody else's project and look at what they're doing and say, oh, okay, I see that he's minifying the code in this file and running it through this optimization process. Okay. So it's definitely a good idea to sort of try these things out for yourself. And trying out Gulp Jasmine is a great place to start.
Great. Well, thanks, Michael, and thank you so much, John. We're almost out of time. So any parting thoughts, John?
Just that if it can be a little intimidating to get started on a build tool like Gulp or Grunt, and I totally understand that. They're certainly a little different than some of the work that you're probably going to be doing. They're kind of doing a lot of the boring stuff that we'd rather not be doing, but are kind of important. But in the grand scheme of things, it's just going to make your life so much easier using one of these tools. And it's good to get started now when you're already sort of absorbing all this material and you can kind of begin including small steps of this into your workflow. By no means should you try to write your whole workflow now. I would say, maybe for the next project you work on, maybe just try getting Gulp set up with it and have it minify your files, and that's it. From there, just worry about building the project. And then as you think about more things you want to be able to do with Gulp, try integrating those processes and pieces one step at a time. So like I said, for example, maybe one project just minify code. Maybe the next project you include live reloading. Maybe the next project you include some image optimization. There's by no means no hurry to really learn these, but I'd say every developer I know uses them. So it's important to know them eventually as a front-end developer.
It's great to just get started right now with baby steps, though.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Okay, well, that's all we had. Hope this was helpful. John will be putting up the transcript on the broadcast category, and we'll see you next week in a webcast.
Yeah.
We'll let you know what it will be about. John and I need to have some talking to do.
Yes, we need to figure out what to do next week.
Yeah.
The write-up too will be up in probably about 15, 20 minutes. So you can feel free to go to, again, the broadcast channel of the discussion boards for the front-end nano degree, and you should be able to find it there. I just have a few more things that I got to throw in there, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, all right. Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye.
thanks for joining, everybody.